Great. So let's start today's webinar. So, good evening, everybody. My name is Ipshita, and I am going to be the speaker for today's webinar, wherein we'll be covering like what are user stories and what are use cases. And just before we start with the agenda, probably we'll just quickly talk about Techcanvass. So basically, Techcanvass is a company which basically provides different courses for certification, and it is mainly into business analysis and testing. So there are a wide range of courses that we usually provide, and once you get into the website, you'll be able to see more details about it. But the major classifications are we are into different business analyst certification courses, which includes the usual business analyst courses as well as the agile stuffs as well. So we have advanced agile concepts and the general agile mindsets and other stuffs. Also, there are a lot of domain specific courses which deal so there's specific banking domain and insurance domain, etc., which we deal with. And in the testing front, there we also have automation testing programs and then different courses on advanced seleniums and others. Now getting right into the today's webinar is basically like the topic is user stories and use cases. So these are nothing but basically depiction or ways in how do we depict requirements. So before we actually get into the crux of the main topic, let's understand what requirements is all about. So I understand most of you are from the business analyst domains, and you guys must be already working on user stories or writing use cases in your day-to-day life. So just a quick glance through of what requirements are all about. So although we all know, but still just a quick recap about the stuffs. So it's basically the condition or a capability possessed by the software to solve a real world problem. So we, as a business analyst, whenever we go and get requirements from the customers, our main intention is to understand the problem statement or the need for which the customer has hired us, of course, and then we try to provide solution and go into the different methods of software SDLC stuffs and then get the solutions, the required solutions out of it. But the main thing or the main important crux is to understand what is the problem statement and then provide solution to it. So that's what requirement is basically all about. So it can be like building a new system from the crux altogether. So from the scratch, you're trying to build up a new system, a new platform altogether, or it can be making some modifications or changes in the existing system that is already there probably. So that depends on the situation, depends on the need. That's where we come up with what solution we are going to provide. Now, basically, this is the requirement classification schema, wherein the requirements are broken down into 4 different categories or the 4 different types. The first one is business requirement. Then we have stakeholders requirement. And third one is the solution requirement and transition requirement. Right. So the business requirements, as I was talking about, is nothing but the high-level business goal. So probably when we go to customer location to get the requirements, it is that high level statement or the high level business need or the requirement that we need to understand when as a business analyst when we try to get requirements from them. So that is basically the business requirement. So probably a quick example is if it is an e-commerce, a shopping inventory kind of a domain, and the sales for the particular customer is getting very low. So that is my one of the business statement. It can be like how to increase the sales. So as a business analyst, when you provide solution to it, you can either ask them like, okay, you already have an e-commerce site, so what are the reasons for which your sales is low? Why don't you go for a mobile app? So that's the solution that you provide. But my business requirement or the business goal is to increase the sales. So what are the things I can do in order to ensure that the sales increase? So that is the business requirement is all about. So any solution that I provide will be around the requirement or the need that my business sales is low. I'm not able to sell the products. Next is the stakeholder requirement. So basically, a stakeholder. So when you go and take requirements from in the customer's location, so there can be, you're just dealing with one person who is a product owner, or one person who is your customer who is just providing you the requirements, or there can be a group of people. So basically, stakeholders are nothing but group of people, or that one person who is directly using the uh, solution that you will be creating. So it can be like, some of the stakeholders would just use a certain bit of the product, and some of the stakeholders would be using another bit of the product. So it's not necessary that the requirements that you get from the stakeholders, everything has to be, you know mm, taken into account and worked upon, but you need to understand what is, or and basically prioritize, like, how the end user gets affected, which are the important stakeholders, so which are your primary stakeholders, which are your secondary stakeholders. So basically you need to prioritize as and when you understand the business more about it. So that's the stakeholder requirements, that's where the stakeholder requirements come from. Next is the solution requirements. So this is a very direct thing. So basically, when you think of building a solution, what are the basic features that your solution would possess? So either you are making some changes in the existing system, or you're providing a new solution altogether. So that's what your solution requirements talk about. It can be any changes in the process as well. It can be any automation that you're providing. So anything, any solution that you're giving to your customer gets into the solution requirement. Solution requirements are again broken up or classified into two different kinds. One is a functional requirement and the other one is non-functional. So basically, when we talk about functional requirements, it basically describes the typical behavior that the system will possess. So what function does the system do? So if it is a mobile app, so probably, you need to install the app. You can, if it is a mobile e-commerce site I'm talking about, so you need to just get into the system. You need to see your inventory. You need to select the products, put it in your cart. So these are the basic solutions that you're providing, or that the complete application would have. So these would come under your functional requirements. Also, there are certain requirements which are termed as non-functional requirements, and these are basically something that will not be explicitly told to us by the customer, but these are the basic qualities that any system needs to possess. So, for example, it's like the page load time. So, basically, when I am selecting the list of, or when I'm just browsing through the list of products that the particular site provides, it should be like, the page load time shouldn't be more than a second. So these are the basic non-functional requirements which make any system, has, which actually enables any system to go through sort of quality checks. So of course, if the load time of the product is, or the, the page is quite more than a second, then probably my product will not be able to be at par with other systems. So these are certain non-functional requirements which are, the basic necessities or basic qualities for any system to possess. Of course, there is a set of transition requirements as well. So these are not permanent changes, but these are basically to facilitate the transition from the current state to the future state. So, for example, if you're doing some database migration, so probably though, while migrating from one system to another, you might have to put some, you might have to take some measures, or you might have to come up with some new changes. So, of course, those changes will not be permanent. Once the migration is done, probably you will make those redundant, but still those will be classified into a set of requirements which are termed as transition requirements. Going to the next slide. So this is a very typical simple example so that everyone understands what it is. It's not related to software at all. It's just a very generic example. So going through this example is like, the requirement is to build a home which was burned down before. So it's sort of a replacing that home, and we're doing an additional garage in that house itself. So when I talk with the stakeholders to get the requirements, I get a lot of requirements from them. So it's like one of them, example one states like we need a family house with 4 bedrooms so that each child has their own bedroom. Example 2 will tell me that, some other stakeholder probably will tell me that I want to have independent washrooms from, so that children can use one and parents can use one. um, Example 3, so which means another stakeholder would say that, okay, we need to ensure that, the house is quite sturdy enough so that it withstands these natural calamities and it doesn't break up again. So all these things which I write down as a business analyst or probably as an architect of the house is going to be like, taking requirements from the people who will be using or who will be staying in the house. So they are nothing but my stakeholders who are directly impacting the whole who have been impacted in the whole situation. Now it comes to, when I need to write down the solution. So this is how I basically map it. So the one of the solutions is like, so I have to list down all the before reaching to the solution. Basically, I need to understand what the stakeholders requirements are and then take those into consideration. So of course, one of the stakeholders said that I need to ensure that my room is painted in pink. So of course, from here I understand that, okay, this is probably a little girl who wants, who has raised a small little requirement. So basically, from the stakeholders requirement, you basically need to understand your primary stakeholders and your secondary stakeholders. Again, in example 2, wherein I want my bedroom floor to have at least 30 square meters so that I can practice my skateboard, etc. So these requirements probably is coming from a teenage boy. The other one, which says example 3, which talks about having air conditioners implemented, which is probably the father of the house, or who wants such kind of a requirement. And the fourth one, which talks about, okay, the walls should be quite sturdy to prevent any fire damage, etc. So probably this is a stakeholder who is sort of a builder or an architect. That's how I try to understand who are the various stakeholders who has given the requirements. And then finally, I would break them into my functional and non-functional requirements. So of course, my functional requirements would be how the look and feel of the house should be, what is the size of the bedroom, what is the color of the bedroom, having air conditions everywhere. So that all comes into the functional requirements. The non-functional is going to be, of course, it should have 4 walls, that's for sure, and it has to be sturdy enough, which is coming from from this particular requirement if you go back. So it comes from the example 4, where when we talk about that the wall should be sturdy enough. So this is something I'm not able to see it, I'm not able to have that look and feel, but I know that this is the basic quality that my house should possess. So that's why it's a non-functional requirement. And a transition requirement is going to be, when I am shifting my furniture, I want the floor to be covered with sheets so that the carpets are not, affected, or the carpets are not torn. So that is my transition requirement. So once probably all the furnitures are shifted, I don't want the floors to be covered with sheets. So that's how it's all been broken down. And that's how the different types of requirements are classified into the various stuffs. The main thing, which is use cases and user stories. So before we jump into this, one thing is very clearly we need to understand that both use cases and user stories are, of course, ways of depicting requirements. And they are two different things altogether, because use cases are mainly used when we follow a waterfall model, which is nothing but a software development lifecycle model. And user stories are something where we actually follow our agile. So when we follow the agile mode of development, we write user stories. And when we follow the waterfall model or the spiral model or any other conventional way, we use cases. Nowadays, however, most companies are switching to agile because of its own benefits and other things. So let's get into what a use case is all about. So use case is nothing but a list of actions or events, that steps typically defining the interactions between a role and a system to achieve its goal. So if you see the diagram here in the screen, so this, the one in the middle is nothing but my ATM system, okay? And I have different roles. So I have bank, that is a role, and I have a bank customer, that is a role. Okay, so use case will tell me how the different rules interact with this system, which is nothing but my ATM system currently in this example. So what are the various events or what are the various functions that I can do as a bank customer with the bank? So I can withdraw cash, I can transfer funds, I can deposit funds. So all these things becomes sort of events that two different roles are interacting with the system. So that's what use case is all about. So you identify the various events or the steps, and then you try to write down in the logical flow of the various actors and the events and how do they interact with the system. And of course, there is one more role that is here, which is the maintenance person, whose role is always just to refill the cash in the ATM machine. Now, what are the typical components of use case? So when we actually write, so use cases are quite big in length. So you can actually write pages and pages of use cases because it is all event specific. So use cases are always you understand or you identify a particular event and the flow, and then you need to write the use cases for that. So the first thing that you need to know is the name of the use cases. So basically to label down, to describe what purpose that you're trying to achieve in that use case. And you probably need to list down the event that you're trying to highlight in this use case. The next thing is to identify the actors. So the other so here basically you need to understand what are the individuals who are involved into the system, and what are the any actors that is going to use these particular events. So upfront probably we need to understand and highlight those before we write the use case, or it's a typical template as well that you follow. So you need to understand, so if it is any system, if these are any individuals, so you just need to understand and identify those actors and write it down. Next is precondition and assumptions. So basically here you define what's the state of the world is prior to the beginning of the use case. So basically some preconditions that you want to, or some assumptions that you make that these things should be there before this event starts or before this use case starts. So you need to explicitly ensure that those preconditions are highlighted. Post conditions are something like after that particular event or the use case that you've written, after that event is completed, what are the things that should happen? So that's your post condition. So that's what again you need to clearly understand and write. And business rules. So again, so these are nothing but sort of, if there are any business rules that is there in the system, you need to specify them clearly. So for example, if it is an order placing system that happens every day between 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., so that is a business rule because that is a specific to that particular system. So if there is something like this in your requirements, you need to clearly mention that. Then it's going to be the normal flow. So basically, we write down the happy path in a very typical form of a flow by step and sequentially numbering those particular paths. So that becomes my normal flow. Now, there can be also an alternate flow. So if my normal flow has steps from 1 to 5, and there can be an alternate flow wherein from step 2, there can be another alternative path for that particular use case, you can also mention that. So that's the reason it is very important to sequentially number your the process flows. Basically, when you write down the use case, it's very important to sequentially number them so that in case there is any alternate flow, you can just divert it and refer to that existing number. So we have a case study here. Probably that will help you to understand clearly. So this is one case study wherein here the name of the use case is basically ordering of materials. So this is a typical template, so of course it helps to to write down by whom it is created and the revision dates, etc., so that you can keep a track of the reviewing and other bits. You can have a little description as well, which helps you to understand what it does. So there is this company, so these are all hypothetical examples just for you guys to understand how it works. So basically, ABC Corporation, buyers, it submits materials to one of the pre-approved list of material vendors. So the basically the event that this use case is dealing with is ordering of materials, right? So the actors involved here is going to be, of course, this company, which is the ABC Corporation buyer, a SAP application or a SAP module where the material list of materials they are going to select and order, and a pre-approved list of vendors, so from whom they're going to order. So these are the three actors that has been clearly identified before the use case, before the actual flow has been written. Precondition here is like we assume that the vendor already has a pre-approval in the ABC Corporation's ordering system. The funding of the material is all available, so there is no shortage of fund, and the material that being ordered is also available for purchase. So we assume that these things are already there, and then the typical event or the normal flow will go through. And also once these this ordering of material, which is my event, has occurred, these will have certain post conditions. So what are those conditions that is there? So these are like, so the once I've ordered the material, the vendor receives funds for purchase of the material, the ABC Corporation receives the material within the designated time frame that they have been told of, and the ABC Corporation's material amount is reduced by the cost of the material, and the inventory numbers are updated. So that's what happens. So these are the typical post conditions. Like once my order has been successfully made, these are the 4 steps that's going to happen. So this is very clear. Now we talk about the normal flow. So here, typically for ordering the material, so this ABC Corporation buyers identifies the material that he needs to order. Then he consults the pre-approved list of vendors to identify who is going to be the supplier. And then he also confirms that funding is available. He submits the order to pre-approved vendor. The vendor receives the orders and verifies that the material is available, and he also accepts the funding transfer. The vendor then pulls out the material, submits it for shipping. In the 7th step, the ABC Corporation receives the material. 8th step, they enter the material receipt for verification and update into their SAP inventory system. And in the 9th step, the funding transactions are confirmed between the ABC Corporation and the vendor. So that is going to be the complete step 1 to step 9 is the basic happy path flow for the complete order material order event. Next, there can also be an alternative flow as well. So from step 5, when the vendor receives the order and verifies that they have the material available, there can be a situation that the vendor realizes that he doesn't have that material available right now. So what does the vendor do? The vendor probably will put a hold status. They'll put the status to on hold, and the vendor will probably order the material from someone else, and they will provide the estimated time frame to ABC Corporation. And once he receives the material, then again from the step number 6, the normal flow will start. So if at all you think that there can be an alternative flow to that particular event, in the alternative flow you can specifically mention that as well. And there also can be some exceptions. So if at all you need to highlight those, you can also highlight the exceptions here as well. So what happens here is like in step 2, which is from when the ABC Corporation consults the list of pre-approved vendors and identify the suppliers. So here they realize that the ABC Corporation identifies that there is no pre-approved vendor at all. So in that case, what they do is probably they will initiate an internal process to identify suppliers, and then they would get into agreement with who is going to be the potential vendor, get them approved, and add that vendor into the pre-approved list. And once that is done, then probably from step number 3, the normal flow can again start. So probably if any point you feel that there can be an exception in the system, we can also mention those. Again, when we talk about the requirements, so this is the last section which we are just focusing the requirements bit. So this is sort of a business rules or something. So it's like it is optional. You can have but it depends on how well versed, or how intense or how elaborate your case study is all about, or your use case is all about. So basically it says like these requirements must be met before the execution of this use case. So it can be also clubbed into your preconditions or assumptions, but if you want to explicitly mention them as business rules or requirements, you can also do that. So basically, fund availability must be verified prior submitting any material purchase. So sort of a business rule that you want to highlight here. And all materials must compile certain guidelines and procedures. So again, this is also sort of some guidelines, some quality checks that you want to ensure. So those can be added in the requirements section altogether. So if you see, for one event, there is this complete list of flows, and probably these elaborate steps is what you have to write down when you basically deal with use cases. So use case ideally deals with event specific things. However, so any questions so far on the use case bits before we jump on to user stories? Coming to user stories, so again, as we're talking about here, so user stories are completely for agile concept. So when you have, you deal with your Scrum projects, Kanban projects, here when user stories come into picture. And in user stories, you're basically dealing with the end user. Unlike in use cases, wherein I am trying to deal with the typical events that the system is going through. So my focus in use cases is always the system that I'm building. And the different users interacting with the system becomes my actor, and the events or the various transition that my system is going through becomes my events. However, in user stories we are completely focused to the end user. So we talk about sorry right so we talk about the end users as such in user stories. So what the end user is going to do. And a typical way of writing a user story is like, as a user, I want to do something so that I can achieve something out of it. So that's what a typical way of writing, or the typical template of writing a user story. There's nothing no complexity at all in this. It's very straightforward. And we need to ensure that the user stories that we write are like, are just for one small functionality, or just for one small feature. It shouldn't be like a complete event that we are dealing with, but it is just a very small bit of work, or a very small interaction that we are handling it. For example, I can just give you a small thing. So as a bank customer, I want to log into the online portal so that I can withdraw some funds. That's it. So my action here is just going to be the login. That's it. So that is what I am looking for. So a successful login completes this user story. So that's why when we write user stories, they are small and crisp. However, they has to be like, of course, they are more in numbers if you deal with one big functionality or one big event. If you're talking, probably to achieve that event, you might have to work upon 3 to 4 user stories. But it's like, you are just focused on small amount of work, and those are independent enough. So that's what basically a user story deals with. So who is this functionality we're building for? That's the type of user. What should we create is basically the goal that we're looking for, and what is the value that the user will get. So that's what we write in so that the user gets some benefit out of it. Great. So when we talk about user stories again, so there are this 3 C's, the concept of 3 C's, which is very simple. So you need to have a card. So nowadays, of course, we use various tools to write user stories. But earlier, when it was just invented, so people were like just using post-its all over, or just simple cards to write down things. Nowadays, we use tools like Jira, we use TFS, we use Rally. So there are a lot of tools available. So it's like you have a simple card wherein you just, in one side, you just write down the description of your user story that you're planning to achieve. And then next, behind the card, probably you just write down the conversation. So again, when it comes to user story, it is just not the the responsibility of the business analyst to write it. Of course, you need to have a conversation. So as a business analyst, I would just write the description and the requirement that I'm planning to achieve, and then I would have my backlog grooming sessions, and I would have my different agile ceremonies, and talk with the team and the product owners and stakeholders, and write down everything in a conversation. So I would just ask a lot of questions, come up with new ideas, new solutions, and write down everything in this conversation section. And once those things are all there, from there I can actually write down some confirmed tests, which are nothing but these are called as acceptance criteria. So that is the confirmation section. So card, conversation, and confirmation. So the card, it will typically in one line, it will tell me what the story does. You can give it some story point estimation as well, depending on the discussion that you have with your team. Conversation is any discussions that you're having with your team. It can be technical, it can be discussions with your product owner, with your customers, or with any stakeholders. So you just write down everything so that later on, if required, we can go back again. And confirmation is, from these discussions, from these kind of conversations, you write down the acceptance criteria so that it becomes clear for the testing team as well as the development team to understand what they are going to build. So that becomes my acceptance criteria, which is nothing but the confirmation. So this is a typical template of a user story. If you just, if you're without using any tool, if you just typically write down. So this, the title, the priority, and the estimate, the section on blue becomes my card. Then I write down my user story. So as a end user, so you need to understand who your end users are. So probably that's the reason we use a lot of techniques in agile to understand end users, when we try to get the requirements. So we understand, we use the concept of personas to basically understand who my end users are. So basic, so that we identify for whom we are basically building up the functionality. So you need to write down, like, as a particular user, I want this functionality and what is the benefit that I'm achieving out of it. And behind the card, probably you write down all your conversations that you had with all your tech leads, test leads, your product owners, your stakeholders, and then come up with the acceptance criteria. So how, the typical way of writing. So if you see here, the acceptance criteria, it is not necessary to have it in this format, given, when, then. You can just have acceptance criteria in any, just 1, 2, 3 in any statement way as well. You can write it down. This particular format that you see here is basically the Gherkin language when we talk about given, when, then. So given something is there, when this action happens, then this is what is happening. So this is a typical way of writing a BDD approach, which is a behavioral driven approach. So you might have heard about test driven approach, wherein, before writing or before developing the user story, people would actually write the test cases, make all of them fail, and then start fixing them one by one. So that is a test driven development. In behavioral driven development, what happens is you try to understand the scenarios, and using those, you write down in this format, in a given, when, then format. And when the developer tries to develop the user story, they are just focused into these scenarios itself, so that, they pick up each and every scenario and try to fix those. So that's what the behavioral driven development is all about. But again, whichever thing suits the team, that is what is more important. So if you think that, things are really simple and you need not go with this, you can just write some pointers for your acceptance testing and get that worked upon. So the main goal is to get the work done. So that's what is main important. So, whatever suits the project or the team is what we look for. The other point here is the invest criteria.
So sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, sure.
Can you just repeat this? What is the difference actually between this user story and acceptance criteria? When should we use what?
Yeah, so user story is, user story has every user story has to have an acceptance criteria. So acceptance criteria are nothing but, a set of confirmations that you say upon. So basically, a very example that, the login example that I was just talking about. So as a user, I want to log into the bank portal so that I can withdraw my funds, right? So this is what it is. So when I write acceptance criteria for that, I need to write, so okay, point number one, I need to successfully log in. So it's sort of a tests that you write. Okay. Point number two, I need to ensure that there is enough funds so that I'm able to withdraw the money. So that becomes my point number two for the acceptance criteria. And point number three is, if I am not able to log in, probably I need to see a message that, okay, invalid username or invalid password. So that is again my acceptance criteria. So, the tests that goes around that user story, like as a user, I want to log into the bank portal to withdraw fund. Those tests are all written in the acceptance criteria.
Test
Now,
in a sense means the eventualities what we can face during the login is a part
exactly.
of the test, right?
Yes, yes. And now, when you write the acceptance criteria, you can either write it in a very simple way, like, as I said, that ensure that when I log in, I have enough funds to withdraw cash, or ensure that if my username is incorrect, I get a message invalid username. It can be as simple as that in a one liner or two liners, or if it is a bit complex system, or if it is a bit scenario based, event that you're dealing with, you can write it in this format, which is I'm currently showing in the screen, which is a given, when, then format. So this is highly used in BDD approach, which is a behavior driven development, which most of agile teams these days uses. So you can either use it in this. So each and every test scenario, you write it in this particular format. So given, I have enough cash in the system, when I log in, then I am able to withdraw the money. So that becomes one scenario. So when the developer who has picked up the user story works on this particular requirement, he or she will actually focus on the acceptance criteria and try to fix that or try to work around that. So here
Okay.
you are explicitly giving, it's like, giving a little more benefit to the developers, wherein you're actually listing down the scenarios as well, so that they are just focused onto the scenario and working upon that.
So they should also curve out the eventualities what they can face while making out the purpose, right?
Exactly. Right. That's how it is.
Okay,
So
thanks a lot.
again, yeah. So again, whatever suits your team, probably, if you want to, if these things basically depends upon how functionally your team is aware of and how matured your team is. So probably if you have a set of people who are quite matured enough, who has been in the project for very long, then you can actually add one two liners of acceptance criteria and leave it. But if suppose you have a list of a bunch of trainers who are not very sure and the project is new, everybody's struggling, then probably you can do these kind of stuffs as well, which might be helpful.
That in short means every user story should have an acceptance criteria already.
Exactly, that's very important.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Next is that, whenever you write a user story, ensure that you're meeting the invest criteria. So invest stands for independent. Example, basically ensure that when you write a user story, there is no dependency on other any other system. So basically, of course, that is always not possible. So it's like, you need to ensure that the work that you're doing can be independently done. So there shouldn't be any wait time for someone else to finish something and then you start this particular user story. So as much as possible, try to make the story, independent enough so that it's not dependent on any other bits of the system. It should be negotiable so that, in agile, as we already know, because the term agile says that it is agile. So it's, the requirements can change anytime. It's not in a typical waterfall method wherein, you spend 3 months in the customer location, get your requirements, get the BRD signed off, and then start work. In agile, it doesn't happen in that way. So in agile, you have your daily catch ups with your customer. Your customer today, they are, probably the requirement is X. Tomorrow that X might change, because there is this, it's all competitive market outside. So depending on the market conditions, or probably the customer's competitor has already launched a similar feature. So probably, this launching this will not help, they want something more. So the requirements keep changing. So you need to always have that window of negotiation always ready, so that it can always, the requirements can be flexible and it can change any moment. So you need to have that mindset inculcated within the team when we deal with agile, of course. Valuable, you need to ensure that whenever you write a user story, it should have, the end user should generate some value out of it, of course. So that's what requirement all about. Estimable, so that it is clear enough, it is small enough, and the team is able to estimate the size. So whenever we talk about user stories always has to be estimated in terms of story points. So which is nothing but, depends on the complexity, the team would say how much story points it is going to be for the, for the user story to get completed. So that's what, so it has to be clear enough, it should have all the details in it, so that the team can judge what is the estimate for that user story. Small enough so that it can be finished in the sprint duration. So again, when we talk about agile, so agile, if you're following scrum, so scrum usually is from 2 weeks to 4 weeks of sprint. If you're doing kanban, that is also like, you have to finish it up as soon as possible. So in agile, the time frame is really small, you don't get a lot of time like you have in waterfall to work upon the, development bit. So it has to be small enough so that ideally within 2 weeks it can be completed. If you think that, it is becoming too big, and the too many things are getting included, try and break that user story into two. That is absolutely acceptable. So there is no problem in that. Testable, so you ensure that, the testing team is easily, test the user stories based on the acceptance criteria that you have clearly written in the, or mentioned in the user story. And DOD is something called as definition of done. So basically, we'll see in our later examples what definition of done is all about. So ensure in this testable concept that the based on the acceptance criteria, it's clear to the testing team as well to come up with the test cases and the test scenarios. So this is a typical in invest criteria wherein we follow whenever we write any user story. So I think I missed this slide. I'm so sorry. Which is this? This is very important. So basically, how do we break that user story? Like, how do we not break? In fact, so from where does this user story generate? So if you see the one on top, which is the component. So if I again compare with use case, so if you see a use case, it's like basically we talk about an event that is happening. Here, this component is nothing but a typical feature. So a big feature or a big theme that we are working upon in a particular product or the application is what the component is. Now, from there, the component is broken down into various epics. So, epics is nothing but a big, probably. Again, to give you a example, is basically for my epic to, to write. Suppose I have this online e-commerce site. So the epic can be to have filter criteria into the homepage, or into the the page where I'm seeing the list of products. I want to have filter criteria, so that is the epic. So of course the filter criteria can be many. So that one user story cannot accommodate all the filter criterias, like, filtering through cost, filtering through color, filtering through categories. All these things cannot come into one user story, because in that case the user story will be too big. So I can just have a filter criteria epic, and then I can have multiple user stories from that epic. So I can have one, like, you're filtering based on the price. Two, you're filtering based on the color. Three, you're filtering based on the age, whatever, right, on gender. So these can be broken into multiple user stories, so that those are small enough and those can be worked upon independently as well. And of course you can also have tasks. So these are little diversion from user story. So something probably you want to have, or you want to include in the system, but of course this will directly not give you any user benefit. So this can be any technical tasks as well. So suppose you want to design the technical, you want to, add some new tables to your database, or you want to restructure the technical architecture. So those things can be added in the form of tasks. So anything that directly doesn't give value to the end user cannot be added in a user story, but they can be taken up in the form of tasks. and then from the user story you can have different subtasks. So basically it again depends on your team structure. So basically when a user or suppose a developer picks up a user story to develop, so probably they will actually list down what are the things that they need to do. So first is basically analyzing the story, so that becomes one subtask. Second one can be a development. Third one can be giving it to the testing team for testing. So these things can be added in the form of subtasks as well, but these are not necessary that you have to have it. So if your team is independent enough and they can just coordinate well, you might not have the subtasks as well. So this is one example of a typical format. So this is a typical tool that they have used. If you see here, there is a story point, there's map to the typical epic, etc., etc. Also, the release version is being added, and it has a description, and it has an acceptance criteria. So that's how they have actually formed the user story. So if you see here, they the typical format is like, if you're using tools, then you anyways get the auto generated numbers, you need not number it as well. But if you're actually not using tools and writing it down, then probably it's good to number the user stories as well. Also, there is also the status thing. So you can always track the status, if the story is yet to start, or the story is already in progress, or the story is in testing. So these things will actually help you to understand how it is. So if you go through this typical example, so here, as a the description goes like, as a user, I want to just print any item with the details, comments and other things. I should get a printable view in the browser, and then I should have an option to print in different formats. So my acceptance criteria will basically tell me that, okay, all items should be visible, including all these things, which is description, comments, etc. On the preview page, I should get these options to download. So basically like PDF and XML and other bits. And all item types should be printable. So you can just write down, if there are different options, you can also include those in your acceptance criteria. So basically printable format, item types are user stories, epics, tasks, etc. And it is possible to print the item details for almost anywhere. So basically from the item detail view, or from the pop-up, etc. So basically you know it gets you into more acceptance criteria. If you see, it gets you into more of a testing things. So how, and it is very helpful for the testers as well to write down their test scenarios based on the acceptance criteria that you write. So as a user, I want to be able to register online so that I can start the shopping online. So again, my acceptance criteria here is like, you ensure that you submit a form by filling the required field, ensure that the email that the user is providing is not a free email. So basically this again gets into the testing thing. So if it is sort of a free email, then you need to give an error message. Also, again, the third one is again will help you in direct testing to write your test scenarios. So from the same IP, the user should not submit it 3 times within 30 minutes. User can submit any form, so by filling all the required fields. And of course, once everything is done, the user will receive a notification that the registration is successful. So these are typical examples of acceptance criteria. So as I said, so you can actually write it in these way. Or here in this example, if you see the third one, wherein they have actually written down in the given, when, then format. So this is again my bank transfer example, wherein I want to transfer funds between my linked accounts so that I can fund my credit card. So here, that is basically the value statement. And here the acceptance criteria is written in the BDD format. So here I'm typically writing as, given that the account has sufficient funds, when the customer requests for an inter-account transfer, then ensure that the source account is debited and the target account is created. So basically you are providing the acceptance criteria in a scenario format altogether, so that when the development team basically works upon it, it is helpful for them also to work, to understand what the scenario is. And of course, for testing team, it is very straightforward to understand the scenario. So this is one way of writing it. Again, coming back to the definition of done, so definition of done is something which is, just set of criterias. So if you want, you can mention it in the user story itself, or you can have a generic set of definition of done for your project altogether. So which basically say, because these definition of done is nothing related to user stories, it's basically the definition of done which the team would actually follow. So ensure that all user stories should pass unit test cases, ensure that all acceptance criteria are met, code is reviewed, functional tests are passed, and all NFRs have been met, product owner accepts the story. So only when all these definitions of done pointers are met, then I will move the story into the done state. Till then, the story cannot be marked as completed unless if any one of these pointers are pending, the story can never be marked as completed. So that's what a typical definition of done says. So you can either include it in each and every user stories to track, or you can also have a generic list. So it depends whichever is best suited for the team. Yeah. And this bit is, so we understood what are user stories, we understood what are use cases, but as I said, that everything relates to requirements. And what is a typical good requirement is all about something that is complete, so it fully describes what the functionality we are trying to achieve. So something that is complete without any information that is missing, something that is correct. So ensure that whatever you're writing or whatever you are trying to depict is all accurate enough, because based on your information, the functionality will be built in. Something which is feasible. So of course, as a business analyst, we need to understand, like, okay, based on the current limitations and the capacities that you have within the team, the capability and the limitations, whether you will be able to achieve this requirement. So if not, it is always good to highlight it to the customer then and there before you get into your development, much before that. So you need to understand that your team's capability, you need to understand your team's limitation, and then decide upon a typical approach. And necessary, basically you should document things clearly, and you should understand what the stakeholders basically need. So basically the work that, or the functionality that you're trying to achieve, is it really needed by the stakeholders? And of course, if it is, then what is the value add that it is giving? So that needs to be clearly understood. Prioritize, basically you need to assign priority to each and every requirement. So even if you're doing a use case or if you're doing a user story, you need to prioritize that with the help of your product owner. So which one to be worked upon first, which one can be worked upon later. So there are a lot of prioritization techniques as well, which you can refer to while doing this. Unambiguous, so that it's basically like, you should write the user story or use cases such that anybody who reads it knows what the requirement is all about. So there's no unambiguity anywhere. So that's what it should be. And verifiable, so ensure that it is like, clearly written, so that tests can be derived out of it, test scenarios can be written out of it. So that's what is, just keep those things in mind before you write anything, be it a user story or a use case. That's always helpful. Thank you, everyone.